Hi, today we're going to be talking about evolutionary psychology, and it'll be an overview of the extent of this part of the top part of the course. And this is the sort of the event that everything we've done so far is leading to, where we've been setting the stage, we've been getting the background skills and knowledge we needed in order to tackle this section. And this section is about the new approach to psychology, which is based on Darwinian evolution and neuroscience. So we'll be looking at, will be a short introduction, we'll explain where we're headed, and then we'll be looking at a conceptual history of evolutionary psychology. And in the first section, the introduction, we'll be looking at what is evolutionary psychology, Darwinian Natural Selection, which we've done a bit on already, but we'll just revise that a little bit. And we'll look at the core structure, which consists of meeting the necessities of life. What has that got to do with this evolutionary psychology? We'll be looking at social organization, sexual behavior, warfare, religion, neurobiology, and behavior. And first, then there's a question, what is evolutionary psychology? Basically, it's the scientific study of how human nature evolved. In other words, it's based on the fact that it believes that we do have a human nature. We aren't born a blank slate, and we come with everything we need to get on with life already there, just as any other animal does. And how this human nature evolved. In other words, how we got to be the way we are. And it draws its findings from the field of cognitive psychology, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, anthropology, archaeology, and paleontology. So there's a lot of different disciplines that have gone into the subject of evolutionary psychology. And as we've seen with Darwinian natural selection, it sees the structures of the human brain as being shaped, or evolutionary psychology sees the structures of the human brain as being shaped by Darwinian natural selection. And it's the interaction of these structures with the environment that produce human behavior. In other words, it's not all neural networks, it's not all DNA, it's not all nature. In fact, for nature to work, it needs to be triggered by events in the environment. So, for example, you could have a neural network for a particular behavior, and if you're in the course of your lifetime, the events needed to switch that neural network on don't occur, then it will never affect your behavior. Now, the core structure is, as I said, about the evolutionary history, the history of the human brain and human behavior. And we'll begin with a brief look at the history research methods and theories underlying evolutionary psychology. And these will be applied to human behavior within individuals, families, and closely related groups. Now, the first section on the list was meeting the necessities of life. So we're going to consider how the theoretical and practical considerations are applied to the necessities of life, like food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare, and what natural selection and the evolution of our brain has to do with that. And we'll be looking at social organization. In other words, we are social animals, how we got to be social animals, and how does natural selection shape that and shape our brain. We're looking at sexual behavior, and we will examine the theoretical basis for the evolution of cooperation, sex, and sexual behavior. And in particular, we'll be looking at the question, are human beings naturally monogamous? And we will apply the theoretical concepts of evolutionary psychology to the details of human sexual behavior and child rearing, as they were practiced in evolutionary times, of course. These are different times. We'll look at the evolution of warfare, the history of aggression in the human species and in primates, and intergroup conflict, And far from it being abnormal, it's actually an integral part of our evolutionary history. Mind you, if something is natural, it doesn't make it right. In other words, just because uh, aggression has been part of our evolution doesn't mean that aggression is a good thing and we should continue doing it. It just means that we are sort of hardwired, our brains are hardwired for aggression. And if we want to overcome that, then we need to know, number one, that we are hardwired for aggression, and number two, what we can do about this hardwiring. Next, we'll be looking at religion, and we're looking at what is religion and what roles does it play in the evolution of human behavior and human cultures. And we'll be looking at the connection between neurobiology and behavior. Mostly up till now, when people talked about innate behaviors, they were really talking about physical, more physical rather than mental. In other words, it's how our body works and what the brain has to do with that, what the connections between neurobiology and the working of our body. But however, we're taking it one step further, and we're also making a connection between our brains and our behavior. In other words, how does the how do the neural networks in our brain affect our behavior? Okay, and that includes not just our behaviors but our emotions as well. And we'll be looking at the possibilities that some mental illnesses may have evolutionary roots, and that includes social problems as well. Now, the part of this topic, evolutionary psychology, a conceptual history, and in this topic we'll be covering the fact that human beings are people watchers. In evolutionary times, watching other people was essential for survival. In other words, if we couldn't correctly or reasonably correctly assess the intentions of another person, whether they were there out to help us or harm us, then our lives could have been quite short. And we'll be looking at the evolutionary perspective of behaviour, and it'll be a new way of understanding how we do look at behaviour. We'll be looking at a unified theory of behaviour, and we'll be looking at behavioural studies, the behavioural studies revolution in the 1960s, and where we might be headed from here. Well, firstly, human beings are people watchers, and as I said, it was essential for human beings to be able to have some idea of the intentions of other human beings, and not only that, but also other animals that may have intentions of having us for lunch or dinner. So it's a good idea to have a pretty good, concept of, or pretty good ability to judge what other life forms may be intending towards us. And it's always a good idea to err on the side of caution, because if you assume by nature that everything is harmless, then you're going to get hurt. If you're, on the other hand, you assume that a lot of things can be harmful when they're actually not, then you won't get hurt. On the other hand, you may have made a wrong assumption, but it's a wrong assumption that isn't going to get you killed or harmed. And as I said, people watching is adaptive. So being able to estimate what other people or other animals are intending towards you is good for your survival. Now, the subject of evolutionary psychology, of course, is us, and how we came to be and how we operate. And it'll all be seen through the lens of Darwinian natural selection. Now, the methods that evolutionary psychologists employ are primarily observation of people, And this can be directly or by indirect information, such as demographic data. They observe people in their natural habitat, and also they can also conduct laboratory experiments. Of course, where human beings are concerned, we're fairly limited on what we're allowed to do to them in the experimental situation. Although I must admit, in not so long ago, there's some pretty nasty things happen. But these days, you can't do anything to a human being that's going to physically or emotionally harm them. And of course, we need to be able to observe people without biases. So in other words, with the observational method, we need to approach it with a complete open mind, not preconceptions. So we ought not to be out there looking to confirm our theories. In other words, we go out there with an open mind, see what's actually happening, and then see whether that fits what we've thought already. If it doesn't, then we have to change what we think. And of course, there's self-reporting going on. In other words, evolutionary psychologists ask people what they're up to, or what they're doing, and why they're doing it. And of course, people may endeavour to be open and frank and honest. On the other hand, some people are only half open, half frank, and half honest. In other words, there's things that they won't say, won't report. So self-reporting as a method of observation or method of study of people isn't that reliable. But if we study the unreliability, we'll find out maybe some of the motivations why people can into the business of self-deception. In other words, I have always thought that if we could make money out of our ability to deceive ourselves, then we'd all be billionaires, because the human capacity for self-deception is enormous and is universal and enormous. I see that really as a survival thing or an adaptive thing. In other words, it was a good idea to not see ourselves too clearly, because in evolutionary times, we survived by being part of a clan or a tribe, a small group of people, and often we went through our whole lives without seeing any other people. They were the only people we ever saw, and it was highly important that we be able to put up a good front. So if you ever wonder why yourself and others are so, good, or they have such a high priority at putting up a good front or keeping up appearances, the reason is that in evolutionary times, you needed to convince the rest of the tribe or the rest of the clan that you were a good person, and you weren't going to cause them any harm or affect their adaptability to the environment in any way. And this capacity to deceive others eventually morphed into a capacity to deceive ourselves. In other words, the best way to deceive others is to deceive ourselves first, and then it's very easy to deceive others, because if we don't know what we're doing, then chances are that we won't rat on ourselves. We won't let things out that ought not, we don't want to come out. Okay. So that's our capacity for self-deception. Now, this evolutionary psychology business is actually a new way of understanding human beings and human behaviour. And as I said, it comes from Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. And it allows us to make predictions about human behaviour in specific contexts. In other words, once we get the hang of how natural selection works, if you find a particular context, then the chances are that you can pretty accurately predict how human beings are going to behave in that context. Now, this natural selection, or Darwinian natural selection, is not the same as social Darwinism. Late in the 18th century, people took Darwin's theories and applied them to in a racial sense. In other words, if you were white and European, then you were superior to all other colours, races around the world, and it was okay for you to rub out or get rid of the others, because that's what natural selection is about, survival of the fittest, they reckon. In fact, that idea was totally and absolutely wrong. Darwinian natural selection is not about survival of the fittest. It's about reproduction of the fittest. In other words, it's about reproductive fitness, not about killing anyone who is inferior. And of course, this social Darwinism reached its zenith with Nazism in Germany in the Second World War, when they were anyone who was not of the right stuff would at least be put in a concentration camp, if not eliminated completely. Mind you, other countries around the world in the early 20th century weren't far behind the Nazis as far as their attitudes to people who weren't considered to be normal, weren't considered to be an asset to the species. And some awful things were being done even in the United States of America and England and Australia, in the name of social Darwinism, which turned out to be quite incorrect. It's not. We don't evolve in this fashion. We evolve in quite a different fashion. We evolve through cooperation, not through rubbing out the opposition. Now, the why and the what. So evolutionary psychology is about what we do and why we do it. And historically, psychologists have either studied external behaviour or internal motivation. You might say that the American behaviorists studied only external behaviour, weren't interested in internal motivations. And the Freudians were interested only in internal motivations and weren't the least bit interested in external behaviour in terms of observing it and testing their theories. So the behaviour part is about what an organism does, and the motivation is about why it does. Evolutionary psychology brings both of these together and not only considers the what, but also the why. And my personal experience of this is that the what is important. However, if you know why something is happening, then often it makes it easier to control the what. In other words, if you know the why, getting around the what is much easier. Just trying to do with the what without knowing the why can be quite difficult, if not impossible. Now, this what and why thing has split psychology into two hostile camps for a long time, up until the 1960s. And we had experimental psychologists who only wanted to study observable behaviour. And we had theoretical psychologists who were interested in motivations and mental states. And this split, or this dichotomy, was mirrored in evolutionary biology. That's the branch of biology that studied how we got to be the way we are. On the one side, we had the laboratory scientists who conducted controlled experiments on species. And on the other hand, they had the theoreticians who formulated scientific theories about why animals would do what they're doing. Evolutionary psychology includes both rigorous and unbiased observations of behaviours and an explanation of the underlying causes from the perspective of evolutionary biology. It's the first unified theory of human behaviour. In other words, we bring the behaviour itself and the reason or the motivation for the behaviour together in the one theory. Now, the data sources for evolutionary psychology are usually simple observations, and this can come from interviews, questionnaires, and also from census data or other demographic data that's collected. Of course, in this day of algorithms and digital technology, the amount of data that can be collected on and about people is unbelievable, and the speed with which it can be obtained is lightning fast. When I did my studies for this business, there was no digital technology. There was no internet. If you wanted information, you had to go to the library and had to search for it physically. Even the catalogue was a series of cards in boxes. And if you wanted information from somewhere else, you had to send off a request to get a book or an article sent to you. Now you can do it all from the comfort of your armchair, search the whole world. Now, general evolutionary theory says that some explanatory concepts in evolutionary psychology are derived from general evolutionary theory, and abstract theories have suggested empirical tests, which in turn suggest new theoretical analyses. So it's a bit like some observations suggest theories, and tests of those theories suggest new theories. And that brings us back to the fact that science is not about finding the truth. Science is about becoming less wrong. So it's a process of over a long time, conducting studies and sort of thought studies or thought experiments and actual physical experiments and observations to find out where we were going wrong before and what we need to change in order to get closer to reality. And one part of evolutionary psychology includes the study of non-related human species. In other words, primates are a good source of information about how human beings came to be. We evolved from the great apes up to about 6 million years ago. We split from them, and then us and chimpanzees were on the same path, the same species, until about 2 million years ago. And then chimpanzees went one way and we went another. And because we decided to stand up on our hind legs and walk upright, we needed a bigger brain, because you can't stand upright without falling over, without having a very complex brain. Now, that very act of doing that caused some changes. There was changes in the size of our brain and the complexity of our brain, and it changed our neck configuration. In other words, our neck went to the rear of our skull, not the middle or the front. And this enabled us to develop speech, the human speech. We can do more than just grunt and growl and make a few noises. We can make quite sophisticated and complicated sounds with our larynx and our windpipe. And that could not have happened if we hadn't stood up on our hind legs. And of course, once we developed the brain needed for standing up on our hind legs without falling down, then that led to other developments in the brain, and then more. And then we developed language that led to other developments in the brain. So it's sort of one thing led to another, led to another, led to another, led to another. But basically, we're still primates. It's just that we are primates that have outstripped all the other primates when it comes to brain complexity and the ability to communicate with language. Doesn't mean the others are dumb, doesn't mean that they can't communicate, just means that we do it better, or more complex, let's say. Now, psychology itself evolved over a long time, and it was always about trying to predict human behaviour and work out what are the motivations for people. And in ancient times, people were considering human behaviour in different ways. There have been, scrolls found that talked about, I think in Egypt, that talked about what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. In other words, they were interested in what happened to warriors when they came home from war, and how strangely they behaved compared to what they were before. And they thought long and hard about that. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in Palestine, they talk about the different temperaments in humans. And the ancient Chinese, as long ago as over 2,000 years ago, employed psychological tests as part of civil service examinations. They invented the whole concept of examinations for choosing people for their civil service. And if you're interested in Chinese culture, it is the longest uninterrupted culture ever to exist in the human race. I mean, when I say culture, civilization. It's the longest uninterrupted civilization. In Europe, civilizations rose and fell. In the Middle East, same, rose and fell. But in China, it's just one long, continuous civilization. Now, the term psychology was defined in the year 1590 by a German philosopher called Rudolf Goclenius. And he based it on the Greek word psyche, meaning soul. And of course, ology means the study of. So it really means knowledge or understanding of the human soul or spirit. And if you remember back to the beginning of this course, we talked about how for a long time we were dualists. We thought that the brain was quite separate from the body. No, not the brain. The mind was quite separate from the body, and we were body and soul. We consisted of two separate substances, and mind you, they never quite found out how they were connected or where they were connected or why. But it was they thought in terms of soul rather than brain, although the thought that the brain might have something to do with the mind goes back at least 2,500 years in Greece. Now in 1672, a guy called Thomas Willis asserted that the soul is a function of the human brain, so he was getting a bit closer. And before that, it was situated, they thought the soul was situated in the heart or with some other immaterial entity. In other words, it was hovering around above us or beside us or behind us or something. But he tried to locate it in the human brain itself. Now, psychology as a science began to develop around about 1879 when a German psychologist called Wilhelm Wundt decided to study human behavior and mental states in a laboratory setting. And in 1890, an American guy called William James published the first edition of a textbook on the principles of psychology, which was like a collection of all that had been found so far by experimental or laboratory studies of human beings. And the American Psychological Association was founded in 1892. So psychology as a science is relatively recent, but the idea of studying people has been around for a long time. Now, Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 and died in 1939, and he brought a different view to psychology, and he saw it in terms of hidden or unconscious drives which made us do certain things. He didn't quite see it in terms of natural selection. It was just the way we were, and it probably came from our childhood. That was what happened to us in our childhood. And although he trained as a neurologist, a medical neurologist, he didn't bother to actually test out any of his theories. He just assumed they were true. They must be true because he thought of them, and his followers had better believe that they're true, and don't bother testing them because we know they're true already. So he invented psychoanalysis based on the idea that all human behavior is ultimately motivated by unconscious drives, such as hunger, thirst, fear, and especially sexuality. And he gave sexuality to sort of the prime place when it came to determining human behaviour. Of course, these drives are, according to Freud, were unconscious and unobservable. Therefore, there's no point trying to observe them. And of course, in his theories in the early days weren't even, people didn't even try to test them. In other words, it wasn't thought necessary to test these theories. It was self-evident that they were true. Therefore, don't test them. Now, in the United States, the United States being the United States, decided that this wasn't good enough. No, we had to observe human behaviour. I mean, test human behaviour, put it to the test, and see what we came up with. And they went in the complete opposite direction. They said, well, we cannot test human motivations. We can only test human behaviour. That's all we can see. So they went down the road of behaviourism. In other words, forget about motivations, forget about drives, just work on behaviours. And with enough information about human behaviour, we can actually control people's behaviour and or mould shape the sort of person we want to have in the future, with no regard to internal motivations at all. Now, this survived until about the 1950s and then went out of fashion, and other theories took its place, more humane, more humanistic theories. But we still didn't get a good balance between behaviour and motivation. There was a call it a disconnect there, sort of a bit of a disconnect there. Okay. Now, in the 1960s, we had a behavioural revolution, which took part in 4 different academic disciplines. One was linguistics, another one was computer sciences, another one was neurobiology, and another one was animal behaviour studies. And with the linguistics revolution, a guy called Noam Chomsky, pretty controversial sort of guy, came up with the idea of a structure in the brain that determines the learning of language. In other words, a child doesn't learn language the way that they learn other things. They called it a language acquisition device in the brain, and it sort of turns on at birth or before birth and switches off around about 5 years of age. And in that time, the ability of the child to learn language is unbelievably phenomenal. It outdoes any other sort of learning that a human being can possibly do. And the behaviourists tried to explain the learning of language in terms of reward and punishment by the parent, but there's no way that the complexity of language could ever be taught through reward and punishment. It would be impossible. It requires something much more complex than that. And he postulated that there's a deep structure in the brain during those years where the human being is ripe for learning language, and that not only that, but the languages have a sort of an inbuilt, or it's not a device for learning a particular language. It applies to any language, and a young child, you may have found in your own experience, may not have, it can often learn 2 or 3 languages simultaneously and not get them mixed up. So this language acquisition device is something very complex and very powerful. Now, in the computer revolution, well, of course, it was the development of computers and computer programs, and they sort of required a system similar to a mind. In other words, it has a central processor, for putting inputs and a way of getting outputs. So it's like the inputs are the sensations and the outputs are the behaviours. So the computer became a sort of a mirror, well, not a mirror, but a simile for the human brain. And it has assisted science in all areas, even the evolutionary psychology throughout the years, particularly in applying like when it comes to evolutionary biology, they can put in the parameters for the evolution and different types of evolution for different types of species, and come up with a pretty good idea of how a particular species is going to evolve given certain changes in the environment. And then there's a neurobiology revolution. And in many years ago, maybe a couple of 100 years ago, the only experiments on the brain had to be done when the person was dead, because it required actually opening the head and poking around in the brain. And as we developed control of electricity in terms of machines and motors and things, we were able to invent gadgets that could detect the electrical impulses coming from the brain. And that was the beginning of being able to see what was going on inside the brain when behavior was occurring. And now we have incredible machines that can see activity particularly in specific parts of the brain without any contact with the skin at all. And one of them is called a functional MRI. In other words, it is able to read the brain and what's happening in the brain when people are doing certain tasks, and come up with nice color videos of what's happening. And this has been an enormous help to neurobiologists in finding out how the brain works, and which of our theories of the past were a load of rubbish. Okay. And of course, they've learned about the architecture of the brain, the structure of the brain. Originally, they thought it was just slabs, like this part of the brain was like a solid bit of meat that controlled this sort of stuff, this part of the life process, and another bit that he would control, say, language, another bit would control hearing, another bit would control seeing. But we found out since then that no, it's not. We're not. The brain isn't broken up into sections for different jobs. The brain is an incredibly complex network of wiring and neurons that completely defy human engineering. And human engineers could never ever replicate the complexity of the human brain. And also there have been studies, revolutionary studies in animals. It was studying animals, and it's usually around the idea of looking at animals in their environment rather than in laboratories. So it's the ability to go out and they call it ethnography, going out and looking at an animal living its life in the wild. And those people who studied the gorillas, for example, Diane Fossey, for example, was one of them, who went out and sat and actually observed gorillas day in and day out. Was almost part of the tribe themselves. Now, where we're headed in the future, so it's highly likely that we're going to be able to get very specific about which parts of the brain are responsible for which sorts of behaviour, and how it really works, and how the whole neurobiology system, the whole body and brain work together to create human behaviour. And it can be, they are getting to the point where they can, in theory, manipulate genes in order to produce changes. Mind you, there are some problems with that, ethical problems when it comes to fiddling with the what I call the basic structure of a human being, but they're working on it. So, what are the consequences of all this stuff, all this evolutionary psychology business? So it's about who we are, where we come from, why we do the things we do, and where we might be going. And my personal opinion is, if we manage to master the first three, who we are, where we come from, and why we do the things we do, then we can have more control over where we're going. In other words, we're not going to be at the mercy of our emotional side. At the moment, yes, all human behaviour is governed by emotion. We like to think that we're rational animals. Yes, we do have a rational capacity, but the rational capacity in the human brain is really there as a public relations firm. Its purpose is to what you call put a positive spin on the things that our emotions make us do, either before they happen or after they happen. In other words, it's a way of justifying to ourselves and others what it is we're going to do. But the basic motivation for human behaviour is emotional, and that's actually a biological process. It's the way the body works. In other words, it's our body work with chemicals and a highly complex chemical process, and it's a chemical process that produces emotions. And our rational side is only there, mainly there, to make us feel good about the things that we shouldn't have done, but we do. However, the more we find out about how our emotions work and become more aware of them, our own emotions and how they're working within us, the more control we have over them. In fact, we can eventually have rational control of them, provided we face up to the awful truth of human behaviour and how it comes about. So the two questions we're going to be looking at in this part of the course is, how do we know what we know? And the answer is going to be by observing the world around us. So it's a simple question, simple answer, but there are some complex bits to it. Now, it's important to emphasise here that I do not, and evolutionary psychologists do not, maintain that we work on instinct only. In other words, yes, we do have behavioural networks, neural networks that can be triggered by the environment. However, how we behave is a balance, not a balance, but it's a trade-off between the biology and the environment. So both the environment and our biology affect the way we behave. It's not just genes, it's not just DNA, it's not just neural networks. The environment has a big say in it too. And the current thinking is it's around about 50-50. So our behaviour is 50% biological and 50% environmental. And our neural networks can be changed through learning. In other words, if you want to learn a particular skill, you're growing a new neural network. And I've often taught people physical skills as well as mental ones. And particularly with the physical skills, they struggle, practice. And then at one point, all of a sudden, oh, they get it. It's like, it becomes easy then. It becomes second nature. A bit like learning to drive. When you're learning to drive, you get in there, you got to think about the clutch, you got to think about the brake, you got to think about hand signals. Well, they're not doing hand signals anymore, but you got to think about making appropriate signals. You got to think about speed, you got to think about other traffic, you've got to think about road rules, and all these thoughts that have to be going on individually inside your head, and you're having to think hard about them all the time. And eventually the day comes where you can hop in your car, turn on the ignition, and go to some place, and when you get there, can't even remember how you got there. In other words, it's like the whole thing happened automatically because a series of neural networks have been created in your brain, and it's the neural network that does the job. And that applies to any physical skill or talent that we might have. It's a question of growing or strengthening growing a new neural network or strengthening existing ones. So yes, it's not all about DNA. It's not all about the brain, but it is a combination of both. And up until now, scientists or psychologists and psychiatrists and others have tried to say, no, it's one or the other. It's either nature or it's nurture. In other words, you can't have both together. In fact, it is both together. In fact, I liked the T-shirt that said on the front it said nature or nurture, and on the back it said either way it's your mother's fault. But no, it's not your mother's fault. It's all your ancestors. Every ancestor that you've ever had has a say in your behaviour. Maybe not in all of them all the time, but selected bits of it, get into your neural networks. And just as a little side point there, all of us have the DNA or genes of the very first life form that ever came into being on planet Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. That DNA is still alive within every species on Earth. In other words, there's a few little genes in there that were handed down from that very first single cell creature that sprung into life 3.5 billion years ago as a result of chemical reactions with the right temperature and pressure at the time. And this chemical reaction had a thing called an emergent property. And the emergent property of this chemical reaction was different amino acids and nucleic acids and all sorts of other, I think there's three other things that you need. And they all reacting together in a pressure cooker environment, and with all the right conditions of pressure and temperature, and what do you call it, proportions of ingredients, and then bingo, this thing called life sprang out. So, like I said, it's an emergent property. It's a bit like if you were to take your car apart and break it down to its nuts and bolts and bits of metal and bits of plastic, and bits of glass, and spread it out on the grass, it wouldn't look like much at all. But if you come along and you put all those things together in the right way and put them back together in the right way, you get a thing called a motor vehicle, which can take you places and do amazing things. And that's called an emergent property. So you take all those ingredients, which can't do much by themselves, but you put them all together, then something emerges out of that, which is life. And like I said, the DNA, or part of the DNA of that very first creature, is in every single living creature on Earth. And that's why I can get quite emotional about my chooks, because we have something in common. We all share the same DNA from 3.5 billion years ago. All right. And of course, the more we know about what makes us do what we do, then the more control we will have over it. What we can't see, we can't control. Okay. Well, that's it for today. And this is the beginning of our journey into the subject of evolutionary psychology. And it will be a very interesting and entertaining one, because we're going to deal with a lot of the unspeakables, the things that are not allowed to be said in polite society. Okay, well, that's all for now.